15 heavily armed guards screamed as the 2-ton Stallion reared its hooves, shattering the windshield of a customized Range Rover. The East Coast's most ruthless mob boss watched his multi-million-dollar investment go feral. Then, a terrified 6 months pregnant Maid walked into the crossfire, offering her bare, trembling palm. The Falcone estate sat like a fortress, masquerading as a palace in the lush, secluded hills of Dutchess County, New York, surrounded by 300 acres of private forest and guarded by men who carried suppressed Glocks under bespoke Italian suits. It was the untouchable nerve center of the East Coast's most powerful crime syndicate. The Falcone family had outlived the era of the Gotti and Genovese families by evolving. They traded street corners for corporate boardrooms, smuggling ports and real estate. At the head of this empire was Lorenzo Falcone, a 34-year-old billionaire who ruled his underworld with surgical precision and absolute terrifying silence. Nora Hayes did not belong in this world. She was 24, exhausted, and desperately trying to scrub the limestone steps of the estate's grand courtyard before the morning dew dried. Beneath her stiff, oversized cotton uniform, she was hiding a 6-month pregnancy. Every movement sent a dull ache through her lower back, but Nora couldn't afford to stop. She was a ghost, a girl running on borrowed time. Her late boyfriend, Danny, had been a low-level numbers runner with a catastrophic gambling addiction. 6 months ago, he got in too deep with an Albanian trafficking ring operating out of Queens. When he couldn't pay the $200,000, he owed his car mysteriously plummeted off the Tappan Zee Bridge. The debt, according to the brutal laws of the underworld, transferred to Nora. Terrified and alone, she had fled the city, using the last of her cash to buy a fake identity and secure a menial housekeeping job at the Falcone estate. She figured the last place the Albanians would look for her was inside the compound of their biggest, most lethal rival. But hiding in Lorenzo Falcone's house was like living inside a loaded gun. That Thursday morning, the usual quiet of the estate was shattered by the arrival of a massive armored transport truck. Lorenzo Falcone stepped out onto the upper terrace, a cup of black espresso in his hand. He wore a charcoal Tom Ford suit that cost more than Nora would make in a decade. He was waiting for his newest acquisition. Lorenzo didn't do pets, he did power. And his latest purchase was meant to be the ultimate display of it, a rare, purebred Frisian stallion imported from a private breeder in Rotterdam. The beast had cost him $2.5 million. Named Balthazar, the horse was a legend in elite equine circles, not just for his flawless genetics and jet-black coat, but for his lethal temper. Balthazar had already crushed the collarbone of a highly trained handler in the Netherlands. To Lorenzo, the animal's violence wasn't a flaw. It was a mirror. "Get him out," Lorenzo ordered, his voice easily carrying over the hum of the truck's engine. Down in the courtyard, 15 of Lorenzo's best men, enforcers, hitmen, and capos, who wouldn't flinch at a shootout in a crowded Brooklyn restaurant, surrounded the loading ramp. They were visibly sweating. Matteo Lorenzo's heavily scarred underboss stood back, a thick leather lunge line in his hands. The hydraulic doors of the transport truck hissed open. For a second, there was only a heavy, suffocating silence. Then a sound like a thunderclap echoed as a massive, steel-shod hoof slammed against the metal ramp. Balthazar erupted into the daylight. He was a monster of an animal, standing 17 hands high, a rippling mountain of midnight muscle and unbridled fury. The sheer size of him drew a collective gasp from the hardened criminals in the yard. But it wasn't just his size that was terrifying. It was the wild, murderous panic in his eyes. Something had spooked him. Perhaps it was the residual smell of gunpowder on the guards' jackets, or the claustrophobia of the long flight, or the sheer number of men crowding him. Whatever it was, the stallion snapped. Balthazar reared up a towering silhouette against the morning sun and let out a deafening shrieking neigh. His front hooves came crashing down on the hood of a bulletproof Range Rover, parked near the fountain, shattering the reinforced windshield like spun glass. "Grab the line, pin him!" Matteo roared, diving out of the way as the horse lashed out with a lethal hind kick that dented the steel door of the transport truck. 15 men scrambled, shouting over each other. 2 guards rushed forward, trying to throw thick nylon ropes over the stallion's neck. Balthazar simply twisted, dragging a 200-pound mobster across the imported Italian cobblestones as if the man were made of paper. Another guard tried to approach with a syringe of datomidine, a powerful equine sedative. But the stallion spun on a dime, teeth bared, snapping his jaws inches from the man's face. The enforcer tripped backward, scrambling away in sheer terror. Up on the terrace, Lorenzo's grip tightened on his espresso cup until his knuckles turned white. His eyes were cold, dangerous slits. "Incompetent fools," he muttered. The courtyard had devolved into absolute chaos. Dust and gravel flew into the air. Men were screaming, diving behind stone pillars and luxury vehicles. This wasn't a gang war. This was a force of nature they had no weapons against. Balthazar was thrashing violently, his heavy transport halter digging viciously into his face, foaming at the mouth, ready to trample anyone foolish enough to step into his path. And then, stepping out from behind the grand marble fountain, clutching a wooden broom to her chest, was Nora. Nora was frozen, her heart hammering wildly against her ribs. She was pinned between the edge of the sprawling fountain and the rearing 2-ton beast that was rapidly tearing Lorenzo Falcone's courtyard to shreds. "Shoot it!" one of the younger guards shrieked, pulling a customized Glock from his shoulder holster as Balthazar lunged toward him. "Put the gun down, you idiot!" Matteo bellowed, scrambling to his feet. Up on the balcony, Lorenzo's voice cracked through the courtyard like a bullwhip. "If a single bullet touches that horse, I will bury you all alive under the Tappan Zee Bridge. Put the weapons away." The guards hesitated, caught between the wrath of their boss and the lethal hooves of the stallion. In that split second of hesitation, Balthazar spun his wild rolling eyes, locking on to the small, trembling figure by the fountain. He snorted, kicking up a shower of gravel, and began to charge straight at Nora. "Hey, get out of the way, girl!" Matteo screamed. Nora didn't run. She couldn't. With her swollen belly and aching back, she wouldn't make it 2 steps. But as the towering black beast barreled toward her, terror suddenly gave way to a strange, clarifying instinct. Before she was a maid, scrubbing mafia floors, before she was a pregnant widow on the run, Nora Hayes was a Kentucky farm girl. She had grown up in Bourbon County, trailing her grandfather around a failing thoroughbred rescue. She knew the language of horses better than she knew the language of men. As Balthazar closed the distance, Nora didn't see a murderous monster. She saw the heavy leather transport halter strapped tightly to his massive head. She saw the glint of a frayed silver buckle wire that had snapped under the pressure of his thrashing, digging deeply and agonizingly into the sensitive nerve cluster behind his jaw. The stallion wasn't attacking. He was blind with pain, fighting the very equipment meant to control him. Nora dropped her broom. It clattered loudly against the stone. 15 heavily armed guards held their breath, waiting for the pregnant maid to be trampled to death. Lorenzo Falcone leaned over the stone balustrade, his dark eyes locked onto the girl, a sudden unfamiliar spike of adrenaline hitting his chest. Nora stepped forward. She didn't raise her hands in defense. Instead, she reached deep into the pocket of her starched apron. She always kept a handful of organic peppermint candies wrapped in foil to stave off her morning sickness. She unwrapped one with shaking fingers. "Easy." Nora breathed. Her voice wasn't a shout. It was a low, melodic hum, pitched perfectly to cut through the panic. "Easy, big boy. I see it. I know it hurts." Balthazar skidded to a halt mere feet from her, kicking up a cloud of white limestone dust. He tossed his massive head, letting out a threatening, rumbling snort. His nostrils flared red. He towered over her, casting a massive shadow that entirely engulfed her fragile frame. Nora didn't flinch. She kept her eyes lowered, avoiding a direct, predatory gaze, and slowly, deliberately extended her bare palm. Resting in the center of her trembling hand was the white peppermint. "I'm not going to hurt you," she whispered, taking one agonizingly slow step closer. "You're okay. You're safe now." The silence in the courtyard was absolute. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. The only sound was the heavy rhythmic panting of the exhausted stallion. Balthazar's ears pinned back, then flicked forward. He lowered his massive head, his soft velvet muzzle hovering inches from Nora's face. He let out a long, warm breath that fluttered the loose hair around Nora's face. Then, ever so gently, the devil horse extended his lips and took the peppermint from her palm. Nora let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. While he crunched the candy, she slowly slid her hand up his sleek, sweat-drenched neck, her fingers finding the heavy leather buckle of the halter. With a deft, practiced flick of her wrist, she unlatched the heavy brass clip and pulled the frayed wire away from his skin. Balthazar let out a long, deep sigh, the tension instantly draining from his massive frame. He nudged Nora's shoulder, affectionately, nearly knocking her off balance, before dropping his head heavily against her chest, seeking comfort. Nora wrapped her arms around the stallion's massive neck, burying her face in his coarse black mane. A heavy, slow applause broke the silence. Nora jumped Balthazar, lifting his head defensively by her side. Lorenzo Falcone was walking down the grand, sweeping staircase, his polished leather shoes clicking rhythmically against the stone. The guards instantly parted for him, heads bowed in deference and shame. Lorenzo stopped a few feet away, his piercing dark eyes dragging over the impossible scene. His $2.5 million untamable beast was standing docilely beside a maid. The wind whipped through the courtyard, pressing Nora's oversized uniform tightly against her body, perfectly outlining the undeniable rounded swell of her 6-month pregnancy. Lorenzo's eyes flicked to her stomach, then back to her terrified face. 15 of New York's deadliest men, Lorenzo said, his voice a rich, dangerous baritone that sent a shiver down Nora's spine. "And the only one who can control my horse is a pregnant maid." He took a step closer. The sheer magnetic terror of the man was suffocating. "What is your name?" Nora swallowed hard, her hand resting instinctively on Balthazar's neck for support. "Nora." "Sir." Lorenzo stared at her, analyzing every micro-expression on her pale, dirt-smudged face. There was a fierce, protective fire in her eyes that didn't belong to a servant. Before he could speak again, Matteo stepped up behind his boss, a burner phone clutched in his hand. The underboss looked pale. Matteo leaned in, whispering urgently into Lorenzo's ear. "Boss?" The security team just ran her face through the biometric scanners at the gates while she was standing there. "She's not from the agency. That's Nora Hayes." Lorenzo didn't break eye contact with Nora. "And she's Danny's girl," Matteo whispered, his voice tightening. "The runner who owed the Albanians 200 grand before he took a swim off the bridge. The word on the street is that she's carrying his kid, and the Albanians have a hit out on her to settle the ledger. If they find out she's on our property." Lorenzo's expression didn't change, but the air around him seemed to drop 10 degrees. He looked at the girl who had just tamed a monster. He looked at the child growing inside her, a child marked for death by his worst enemies. Nora braced herself, sensing the shift in the atmosphere. She knew she had been caught. She closed her eyes, waiting for the order to have her thrown out the gates, straight into the hands of the men who wanted her dead. Instead, Lorenzo reached out. His large, warm hand bypassed her face entirely, his fingers gently brushing the side of Balthazar's jaw, right where Nora had removed the wire. Then his dark, unreadable eyes locked back onto hers. "She doesn't owe the Albanians anymore," Lorenzo said smoothly, his voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard for all his men to hear. He turned to Matteo. "Pay the debt, from my personal account." Matteo's jaw dropped. "Boss, that's a declaration of war." "Let them come," Lorenzo replied coldly. He looked back at Nora, his gaze dropping to her rounded stomach, a strange, possessive darkness pooling in his eyes. "Take off that uniform, Nora, and move her things into the master wing. My horse seems to like her." The transition from the servants' quarters to the master wing of the Duchess County estate was jarring enough to give Nora whiplash. Within an hour of the incident in the courtyard, her stiff cotton maid's uniform had been incinerated. She found herself standing in the center of a sprawling 2,000-square-foot suite, outfitted entirely by Restoration Hardware, staring at a custom-built Heston's mattress that cost more than the house she had grown up in. Through the floor-to-ceiling bulletproof windows, she had a sweeping panoramic view of the Hudson Valley. She was no longer a ghost. She was the prized guest of the most dangerous man in New York. For the first 2 weeks, Lorenzo Falcone kept his distance. He was a phantom in his own home, leaving before dawn in a convoy of blacked-out Cadillac Escalades and returning long after midnight. But his presence was everywhere. Nora's wardrobe was suddenly filled with cashmere maternity sweaters and silk loungewear from Bergdorf Goodman. A private concierge doctor from Mount Sinai was flown in via helicopter just to check her vitals and ensure the baby was healthy. And then there was Balthazar. Nora spent her days in the climate-controlled stables, the only place she felt truly grounded. The demonic 2-ton Frisian stallion that had terrified 15 hardened mobsters was entirely docile in her presence. She brushed his midnight coat until it gleamed, hand-fed him organic oats, and spoke to him in the low, melodic Kentucky drawl she had buried since moving to the city. Balthazar would follow her around the paddock like a massive, lethal guard dog, placing himself between her and anyone who walked by. She was brushing out Balthazar's mane on a crisp Tuesday afternoon when she finally heard the heavy, rhythmic click of Italian leather boots against the concrete aisle. Nora froze, the curry comb hovering in her hand. Lorenzo stepped into the soft golden light of the barn. He had shed his suit jacket, wearing only a tailored white Tom Ford dress shirt, with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, exposing the dark, intricate ink of his syndicate tattoos. He smelled of expensive oud wood cologne, dark espresso, and something undeniably metallic, the faint, lingering scent of gunpowder. Balthazar's ears pinned flat against his skull. The stallion let out a low, warning rumble, stepping protectively in front of Nora, shielding her swollen belly from the Mafia Boss. Lorenzo stopped a few feet away, a ghost of a smirk playing on his sculpted, shadowed jaw. "He's mine. I paid $2.5 million for him, and yet he looks at me like he wants to crush my skull to protect you." "He just doesn't like sudden movements, Mr. Falcone," Nora said softly, resting a calming hand on the stallion's massive shoulder. "Lorenzo." He corrected his dark eyes, locking onto hers with a predatory intensity that made her breath catch. He took a slow, deliberate step forward. Balthazar tensed, but Nora murmured a soft command, and the horse held his ground. Lorenzo closed the distance until he was mere inches from her. Up close, he was terrifyingly handsome, a man carved from marble and violence. He didn't look at the horse. He looked only at her, his gaze dropping to the prominent swell of her 7-month pregnancy beneath her cashmere sweater. "I heard back from the Albanians today," Lorenzo said, his voice dropping to a low, intimate register that echoed in the quiet barn. Nora's blood ran cold. The curry comb slipped from her fingers, clattering onto the floor. The 200,000. Drayton Hoxha rejected the wire transfer, Lorenzo replied smoothly, mentioning the ruthless head of the Queens-based trafficking ring. "He bounced the funds back from my Cayman accounts. He says it's no longer about Danny's gambling debt. It's about respect. He feels insulted that I stepped into his business. He put a bounty of $500,000 on your head." Nora's knees buckled slightly, the sheer weight of the terror threatening to drag her to the floor. $500,000. She was a dead woman, walking. Before she could collapse, Lorenzo's large, calloused hands shot out, gripping her upper arms and holding her steady. His touch was branding, burning through the soft cashmere. "Look at me," he commanded. Nora forced her tear-filled eyes up to meet his cold, dark stare. "Drayton Hoxha is a dead man," Lorenzo stated, stating a fact rather than a threat. "His crew is dead. His empire is dust. They just don't know it yet. You are standing inside my fortress, Nora. You sleep in my wing. You tame my horse. Do you really think I would let a filthy street thug from Astoria touch something that belongs to me?" The possessiveness in his words sent a violent shiver down her spine. "I don't belong to you," she whispered, her voice trembling. Lorenzo's gaze softened just a fraction, a terrifying display of vulnerability from a man who had none. Slowly, he released one of her arms, bringing his hand down to rest flat against her rounded stomach. The baby, as if sensing the sheer power of the man outside, delivered a sharp, sudden kick against Lorenzo's palm. Lorenzo's breath hitched. For a fleeting second, the ruthless Mafia Don disappeared, replaced by a man struck with absolute awe. Danny was a fool who traded his life for a seat at a rigged poker table. Lorenzo murmured, his thumb gently stroking the curve of her belly. "This child deserves an empire, and I have one to give." Winter descended on the Hudson Valley with ruthless aggression. By late January, Nora was 8.5 months pregnant, heavy aching, and confined entirely to the estate as a brutal nor'easter blanketed Dutchess County in 3 feet of snow. The storm was the perfect cover. It was 2 a.m. on a Friday when the estate's grid went dark. Nora woke with a violent jolt in her massive Heston's bed. The ambient hum of the HVAC system had died. The heated floors were rapidly cooling. Outside the reinforced windows, the blizzard howled, swirling in blinding sheets of white. Then the backup generators failed to kick on. Down the hall, the sound of suppressed gunfire, pft, 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 echoed through the sprawling mansion. Drayton Hoxha hadn't waited for Lorenzo to dismantle his operation. Knowing they were vastly outgunned in a straight war, the Albanians had hired an elite paramilitary hit squad, using the catastrophic weather and signal jammers to bypass the perimeter alarms. They weren't here to negotiate. They were here to slaughter Lorenzo Falcone in his sleep and take the girl's head as a trophy. Nora didn't scream. The sheer primal instinct of a mother took over. She threw off her silk sheets, grabbed a heavy wool blanket, and slipped barefoot out the hidden servant's door, attached to her suite, a layout she knew intimately from her days cleaning the house. She bypassed the main corridors, which were already flashing with the strobe lights of tactical flashlights and echoing with the shouts of Lorenzo's men returning fire. She needed a place to hide, a place nobody would think to look in a firefight. She fled to the stables. The barn was pitch black and freezing, the wind rattling the heavy timber doors. As she slipped inside, she heard the nervous, restless stomping of hooves. The horses were panicked by the scent of gunpowder drifting down from the main house. "Balthazar," she whispered, feeling her way through the dark aisle until she reached the reinforced double stall at the end. The massive stallion thrust his head over the stall door, nudging her shoulder frantically. He could smell her fear. Nora unlatched the door and slipped inside the spacious stall, huddling in the corner on the fresh pine shavings, pulling the blanket tight around her trembling body. Suddenly, a searing, blinding pain ripped through her lower abdomen. She gasped, doubling over and biting down on her own hand to keep from screaming. The stress, the sheer terror, the freezing cold it had triggered her labor. Her water broke in a warm rush against the cold floor. Not now, she prayed, tears streaming down her face. Please God, not now. The heavy barn doors groaned open. 3 beams of tactical flashlights pierced the darkness, sweeping over the stalls. Heavy, snow-crunched boots stepped into the aisle. "Check the stalls," a thick, heavily accented voice ordered. "If she's hiding out here, put a bullet in her and the kid. Hoxha wants proof." Nora held her breath, pressing herself against the back wall. Another contraction hit her, this one so violent it completely stole the oxygen from her lungs. A small, involuntary whimper escaped her lips. The flashlight beams instantly snapped to the end of the aisle. "I hear something," one of the hitmen sneered. Footsteps approached. Nora squeezed her eyes shut, wrapping her arms protectively over her stomach. She could see the beam of light slicing through the wooden slats of the stall. The hitman stopped right in front of the door. He raised his suppressed assault rifle, reaching out to slide the latch open. He never got the chance. Balthazar, sensing the lethal threat to his herd, unleashed hell. With a deafening demonic shriek, the 2-ton stallion spun around and unleashed a devastating double-barrel kick against the reinforced stall door. The sheer force of the impact blew the heavy oak door completely off its iron hinges. The 200-pound door, propelled by thousands of pounds of sheer muscular force, slammed directly into the Albanian hitman, crushing him against the opposite stone wall with a sickening crunch. The man dropped like a stone, dead instantly. The other 2 hitmen panicked, raising their rifles towards the rogue beast. But out of the shadows, a demon in a bespoke suit emerged. Lorenzo Falcone didn't shout. He didn't hesitate. Wielding a customized Sig Sauer, P226 in each hand, he moved with lethal liquid precision. 2 suppressed shots fired in rapid succession. Both remaining hitmen caught bullets perfectly between their eyes, collapsing lifelessly onto the concrete aisle. The barn fell dead silent, save for the howling wind and Balthazar's heavy aggressive snorting as he stood guard over the open stall door. Lorenzo dropped the weapons, ignoring the blood pooling on the floor, and rushed into the stall. When he saw Nora curled on the ground, pale and trembling in the throes of a massive contraction, his heart, a muscle he thought had turned to ice a decade ago, stopped beating. Nora. He breathed, dropping to his knees beside her, uncaring that the designer wool of his trousers was soaking in blood and amniotic fluid. He pulled her into his chest, wrapping his heavy warm coat around her shivering frame. "The baby," she sobbed, clutching the lapels of his shirt. "Lorenzo, it's coming. I've got you," he whispered, fiercely pressing a desperate kiss to her forehead. "My men have secured the estate. The Mount Sinai team is waiting in the underground bunker. You are safe. I swear on my life, you are safe." He scooped her into his arms effortlessly, despite her heavy pregnancy. Balthazar stepped aside, lowering his massive head to gently bump Nora's dangling foot in a silent farewell, as Lorenzo carried her out of the blood-stained barn and into the storm. 10 hours later, in the sterile, brightly lit medical suite, buried deep beneath the Falcone estate, the cries of a newborn pierced the heavy silence. Nora lay exhausted in the hospital bed, her hair damp with sweat, staring in absolute wonder at the scene unfolding by the window. Lorenzo Falcone, the ruthless billionaire don who had wiped out the entire Albanian syndicate before breakfast, stood bathed in the pale morning light. In his massive, heavily tattooed arms, he cradled a tiny, fragile baby boy, swaddled in a pristine white blanket. Matteo stepped quietly into the room, respectfully averting his eyes. "Boss, Hoxha is handled. The Queen's territory is ours. The ledger is clean." Lorenzo didn't even look at his underboss. His eyes were entirely locked on the sleeping infant in his arms. He reached out with one finger, gently stroking the baby's incredibly soft cheek, exactly as he had touched Balthazar, exactly as he had touched Nora. "Update the family registry, Matteo," Lorenzo said softly, his voice trembling with an emotion Nora had never heard before. "The boy's name is Leo. Leo Falcone, the heir to the Empire." Lorenzo walked over to the bed, sitting gently on the edge, and placed the baby into Nora's waiting arms. He leaned down, capturing her lips in a kiss that was a profound, unyielding promise. Nora had arrived at the estate, a hunted, indebted maid, scrubbing floors to survive. But as she looked at the fiercely protective Mafia Boss, kissing her forehead, and the healthy baby boy in her arms, she knew the truth. She hadn't just tamed the devil's horse. She had tamed the devil himself. Did you expect the ruthless Mafia Boss to risk his entire empire for a pregnant maid and his untamable stallion? Sometimes the fiercest protectors are the ones society fears the most. If Nora and Lorenzo's dramatic heart-stopping journey to finding love, loyalty, and an unexpected family kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button. Don't forget to share this story with your friends and subscribe for more intense real-life mafia, romances, and unbelievable twists.